I was just a ghost in a red blouse until I saw the shadow behind the curtain. My fingers trembled as I set the porcelain teacup down, the beverage napkin tucked beneath it like a secret. To the rest of the lounge, I was just a waitress finishing her shift. To the man sitting there, I was a nameless face. But that napkin held a message that would either save a life or get us both killed before the tea went cold. The note was simple, jagged, and terrifying. Your daughter is the target. They're already inside. 5 minutes ago, I'd been in the service pantry, counting out the silver for the late-night rush. I'd stepped behind the heavy velvet curtains to check the stock when I heard the crackle of a radio, a sound that didn't belong in a 5-star lounge. Then came a voice, cold as the soul winter. The girl is secured at the estate. Finish the father now. No witnesses. When I looked through the gap in the curtains, the world I knew had shifted. At table 7 sat Park Jun-sok. The city called him a monster, a king of the underworld, but right now he was just a father enjoying a quiet drink. Beside him, the blonde woman he called his partner, Choi Soo-yeon, was smiling, her eyes fixed on her phone as she signaled the shadow moving near the kitchen exit. I saw the glint of a barrel under a waiter's jacket. I saw the way the guests at the bar shifted their waistbands. They weren't here to kill a mob boss. They were here to execute a father while his little girl was held at gunpoint miles away. I had spent my whole life being invisible, staying quiet, staying safe. But as Jun-sok reached for his tea, oblivious to the masked gunman closing in behind him, I realized I couldn't be a ghost anymore. I had to be the one to scream.
The pantry always smelled of roasted coffee and expensive floor wax, a small, sterile sanctuary where I could breathe for a second away from the heavy expectations of the lounge. I was counting silver spoons, the rhythmic clink, plink, clink, the only sound in the cramped space, until the heavy velvet curtains separating the pantry from the VIP corridor rustled. I froze, a salad fork halfway to the bin. Through the gap in the fabric, a shadow loomed. It wasn't the fluid, hurried movement of a server. It was heavy and deliberate. Then came the sound, a sharp mechanical crackle that made my stomach drop. "The perimeter is clear," a voice rasped. It was a low, jagged sound, vibrating with a coldness that didn't belong in a place this warm. "The girl is secured at the estate. We have the nanny in the basement. Finish the father now. No witnesses." My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure the man on the other side of the curtain could hear it. I leaned forward an inch, my eyes straining through the sliver of light. It was a man in a dark utility jacket, his face partially obscured by the high collar. He wasn't looking at the kitchen. He was looking toward table 7. Following his gaze, I saw Choi Soo-yeon. She looked like a goddess in silk, leaning back with a flute of champagne, laughing at something Park Jun-sok had said. She looked perfect. She looked loyal. But then I saw her hand. Under the table, away from Jun-sok's view, her fingers were moving rhythmically against the fabric of her dress. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. She wasn't just listening, she was signaling. Every time she laughed, she adjusted the silver brooch on her shoulder, the polished metal catching the light and reflecting it toward the bar where 2 men in oversized suits sat, watching her like hawks. The man by the curtain whispered into his sleeve. "The signal is confirmed, moving into the blind spot behind the column, on her mark." I sank back against the cold steel of the prep table, my breath coming in shallow hitches. I was a nobody, a girl from the outskirts who had worked 3 years to get this job just to keep her head above water. If I stayed behind this curtain, I could walk out the back door. I could disappear into the night, go home and pretend I never heard the word estate. I could let the monster at table 7 meet his fate. But the voice had said, "the girl." I remembered the photo Jun-sok kept in the breast pocket of his suit, the one I'd seen him look at when he thought no one was watching. A little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed grin. Harin. She was just a child, and the woman smiling at her father was the one who handed her to the wolves. My fear didn't vanish, but it hardened into something cold and sharp. I grabbed a beverage napkin and a dying ballpoint pen from my apron. I wouldn't be a witness to a murder. Not tonight. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain, the weight of the silver tray in my hands feeling like an anchor. My red blouse felt like a target on my back, the silk sticking to my skin as a cold sweat broke across my neck. I didn't look at the bar. I didn't look at the kitchen. I only looked at Park Jun-sok, who sat with the calm, predatory grace of a king unaware his throne was rigged with explosives. Choi Soo-yeon's laughter rang out again, a sharp, melodic lie. As I approached, she glanced at me, her eyes tracking my movement with a sudden sharp intensity. She knew I had been gone too long. I lowered the tray, my hand grazing Jun-sok's shoulder as I set the tea down. With a flick of my wrist, I slid the napkin toward his hand. His reaction was nearly invisible, a slight tightening of his jaw, a momentary stillness in his fingers. He didn't look down immediately. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine for the punchline of a joke he knew wasn't coming. When he finally glanced at the jagged ink, his entire posture shifted. The air around the table turned frigid. "Aaliyah," he murmured, his voice a low vibration. "The exit," I whispered, leaning in as if suggesting a dessert. "Blocked. The kitchen, too." Beside him, Choi Soo-yeon's hand moved toward her clutch. Jun-sok's hand shot out like a viper, pinning her wrist to the table with a sickening thud. At that moment, the man at the bar stood up, his hand reaching into his jacket. I didn't wait for the first shot. I turned and sprinted toward the flambe station near the center of the lounge. The chef was startled as I shoved him aside, grabbing the bottle of high-proof cognac. I didn't think. I acted on pure, terrified instinct. I smashed the bottle against the industrial range and kicked the gas line valve wide open. A roar orange flame erupted, licking the ceiling and triggering the overhead sprinklers. The lounge turned into a chaotic hellscape of blinding mist and fire. Screams tore through the music as wealthy patrons scrambled for the doors, creating a human shield of panic. Through the haze, I felt a hand like an iron shackle grip my upper arm. Jun-sok was there, his suit jacket singed, his face a mask of cold fury. He was dragging Choi Soo-yeon with one hand and holding me with the other. "The service elevator?" I choked out, pointing through the thick gray smoke toward a nondescript steel door. "It leads to the basement alley. We have to go now." Bullets began to whistle through the air, shattering the crystal chandeliers above us. The ghost in the red blouse was gone. I was the only compass he had left in a room full of monsters. We dived into the dark mouth of the service corridor, just as the lounge behind us turned into a graveyard of glass.
The service elevator groaned as it descended, the metallic screeching echoing the frantic beat of my heart. Inside the cramped space, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, expensive perfume of the woman Jun-sok still held by the throat. Soo-yeon wasn't laughing anymore. Her face was a mask of pale terror, her eyes darting toward the floor numbers as they flickered downward. Jun-sok didn't look at her. He had his phone out, his thumb stabbing at the screen with a violence that made his knuckles turn white. He slammed his hand against the elevator wall when the call failed to connect. "Dead air," he rasped, his voice cracking in a way that made my skin crawl. This wasn't the sound of a crime lord losing his temper. It was the sound of a man losing his world. "The estate lines are cut. My security team. They aren't answering the encrypted channel." He tried again, his breath coming in jagged hitches. "Pick up, Heron. Please, baby, pick up." The elevator doors hissed open into the cold, damp air of the basement parking garage. Jun-sok shoved Soo-yeon toward a black armored SUV, but his movements were uncoordinated, fueled by a raw, primal panic. He reached for the door handle and fumbled, his hand shaking so violently he dropped his keys. In that moment, the King of Seoul vanished. Standing before me was just a father whose child was in the dark with monsters. His eyes were wide, glassy with the realization of his own powerlessness. "They have her," he whispered, looking not at me but at the empty shadows of the garage. I built a fortress to keep the world out, and I let the devil walk right through the front door." He turned his gaze to Su-Yun, his voice dropping to a terrifying, hollow whisper. "What did you do? If a hair on her head is touched, I will make sure you never see the sun again." Su-Yun let out a choked sob, but she didn't deny it. Her silence was the loudest confirmation of the nightmare. "We have to go," I said, stepping toward him and picking up the keys. I had never driven a car worth more than my life, but I knew the streets of this city better than any GPS. Every second you stand here vibrating is a second they get closer to her. "Give me the keys, Mr. Park. I know the back routes. I know the blind spots where the traffic cameras don't look." He looked at me then, really looked at me, seeing the waitress in the stained red blouse who had just traded her safety for his war. He didn't argue. He shoved Su-Yun into the back seat and climbed into the passenger side, his head buried in his hands as he let out a broken, muffled sound, a sob he was trying to choke back. "Fast, please, Aaliyah. Just get me to my daughter." The engine of the armored Sioux roared to life, but inside the cabin the silence was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles matching the bone-white pallor of Su-Yun's face in the rearview mirror. She was slumped in the back seat, the silk of her dress rumpled, but as the initial shock of the fire faded, a terrifying transformation took place. The fear in her eyes didn't just vanish, it curdled into a cold, sharp smile that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You think you've saved him, little waitress," she whispered, her voice devoid of the melodic warmth she had used at the table. "You've only ensured that he has a front-row seat to the end of his legacy." Junseok lunged toward the partition, his hand tightening into a fist, but Su-Yun didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the shadows of the passing streetlights dancing across her face. "Do you really think this was about a few gunmen in a lounge? I've been playing the part of the doting consort for 18 months, Junseok. I sat through your boring galas and tucked your daughter into bed, all while mapping every weakness in your fortress." She let out a dry, jagged laugh. "The board was tired of your sentimentality. They wanted a leader who didn't let a 6-year-old girl dictate the terms of their empire. I didn't just sell you out to Min Tae, I became her partner. While you were busy buying herein those ridiculous stuffed bears, I was replacing your household staff with my own people. The nanny, she was the first to take the payout." Junseok's breath hitched, a sound of pure, concentrated agony. The revelation was a physical blow, more effective than any bullet. He had let the viper into the nursery, and she had spent months coiled around his life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "She is leverage, Junseok," she continued, her voice dropping to a silk-smooth purr. "The apes will vote to replace you tonight. You'll sign over the assets, you'll disappear, and maybe, if you're very quiet, Herin grows up in a boarding school in Switzerland, never knowing her father was a failure. That was the plan. But then, nothing interfered." She spat the word at me, her eyes burning with a sudden localized hatred. I didn't look back. I jammed the accelerator down, weaving the heavy vehicle through a narrow alleyway to bypass the main bridge traffic. My heart was a frantic drum, but my mind was beginning to sharpen. Su-Yun had spent 18 months planning this, but she planned for Junseok's world, a world of boardrooms and high-level betrayals. She didn't plan for a girl who knew which alleys the police ignored and which basements led to the subway. "You're wrong about one thing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not a nothing. I'm the one who's going to get him to that house before your board can even call a vote." Su-Yun's smile didn't falter, but her fingers began to twitch against the leather seat. The chess match had moved from the palace to the streets, and she was starting to realize she didn't know the board. The heavy SUV lurched as I yanked the wheel, tires screaming against the asphalt as we veered off the main boulevard. Behind us, the twin beams of two black sedans cut through the darkness, gaining ground. Min-tae's hunters were efficient, driving with a military precision that suggested they weren't just hitmen, they were professional trackers. "They're closing in," Jun-sok rasped, his eyes fixed on the side mirror, his hand hovering near the door's holster. "If they pin us on the bridge, it's over." "They won't pin us," I said, my voice sounding stranger to my own ears, harder, surer. I didn't have his guns or his millions, but I had a lifetime of navigating the veins of this city. I knew the shortcuts the delivery drivers used to beat the morning rush and the gaps in the fences that the police never bothered to patch. I dived into a narrow alleyway behind a row of seafood wholesalers. The smell of salt and old ice filled the cabin as I navigated the SUV through a space so tight the side mirrors cleared the brick walls by less than an inch. I killed the headlights, plunging us into a world of flickering neon and deep shadow. "What are you doing?" Soo-yeon hissed from the back, her composure finally cracking as we bounced over a series of rusted loading docks. "You'll bottom out the car." "Keep her quiet," I snapped at Jun-sok. I took a sharp left through a construction site, the heavy tires churning up dust and gravel that masked our trail. I knew that 3 blocks ahead there was a drainage tunnel wide enough for a single vehicle, a remnant of the old city infrastructure that didn't appear on any modern GPS. It was a blind spot, a hole in the digital map where Min-tae's high-tech surveillance couldn't reach. The sedans shot past the entrance of the alleyway, their sirens muted, focused on the main thoroughfare where they expected us to be. I waited for 10 seconds, my heart hammering against my ribs, before sliding the SUV into the mouth of the tunnel. The darkness swallowed us whole. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic drip of water against the armored roof. For a moment, the world felt suspended. "They lost us," Jun-sok whispered, a note of genuine disbelief in his voice. He looked at me, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. The man who had been ready to burn the city down looked at the waitress in the red blouse as if seeing a ghost that had suddenly gained flesh and bone. "Don't thank me yet," I said, shifting into gear. "The tunnel lets out 2 miles from the estate. From here on, we're walking into the lion's den." The drainage tunnel exhaled us into a thicket of overgrown pines at the edge of the park estate. Usually, this property was a beacon of light on the hillside, a glass and steel monument to Jun-sok's reach. Tonight, it was a tomb. The exterior floodlights were dead, the sprawling mansion reduced to a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple sky. Jun-sok was out of the car before the engine had fully died. He moved with a silent, predatory lethalness, but I could see the tremor in his grip as he checked the magazine of his sidearm. He didn't tell me to stay in the car. We both knew Soo-yeon couldn't be left alone, and we both knew at this point I was the only person whose eyes hadn't been bought. We dragged a silent, simmering Soo-yeon toward the service entrance. The electronic keypad was smashed, wires hanging like viscera from the wall. Jun-sok kicked the door open, the sound echoing through the cavernous foyer with a finality that made my blood run cold. "Hareen!" Jun-sok's voice was a ghost of a whisper, a plea he couldn't help but utter, even though silence was our only shield. A floorboard creaked above us, then the rhythmic thump-thump of a heavy ball rolling across a hardwood floor. We reached the base of the grand staircase. The silence here was worse than the noise of the lounge. It was the silence of a trap waiting to be sprung. Jun-sok signaled for me to stay low behind the marble banister, pushing Soo-yeon down beside me. He began to ascend, his weapon leveled at the darkness of the second-floor landing. Suddenly, a soft electronic chime drifted from the nursery at the end of the hall, a lullaby melody from a mobile I knew he had bought her. It was a beacon, but as the music played, a laser sight's red dot danced across the portrait of Hareen hanging on the wall. "She's in the nursery," Soo-yeon whispered, a jagged, cruel edge returning to her voice. "But Min-tae is the one holding the remote." Jun-sok froze. In the gloom, I saw his shoulders heave. He was a king who could command armies, but as the nursery door creaked open an inch, revealing a sliver of warm light in the cold house, he looked small.
The assassins weren't just in the house, they were in the one room that was supposed to be sacred. The breach wasn't just physical, they had occupied his heart. I looked at the narrow service duct behind the staircase, the laundry duct I'd seen on the architectural blueprints in the SUV's digital display. It was too small for Junseok, but it was just right for a ghost in a red blouse.
The metal of the laundry chute was cold and slick, smelling of bleach and forgotten dust. I looked at the narrow opening, then back at the service exit, only 20 feet away. The door was unlocked. I could hear the wind whistling through the trees outside, a low mourning sound that promised safety and the sweet, unremarkable life of a nobody. I could run. I could find a police station, or better yet a bus station, and disappear into the gray fog of the city before the first body was even cold. "Aaliyah," Junseok whispered, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't ask me to stay. He didn't command me. For the first time, the power dynamic had completely collapsed. He looked at me with a desperate, silent understanding. He was a father about to walk into a kill zone, and he knew he wouldn't be fast enough to save the girl and himself. He was giving me the exit I had spent my whole life looking for. I looked at my hands. They were stained with soot from the lounge fire, the nails jagged and broken. For 24 years, I had been a ghost, a girl who moved through rooms without leaving a footprint, who nodded and smiled and stayed silent to avoid the friction of the world. If I ran now, I would be a ghost forever. But Harin wasn't a ghost. She was the gap-toothed girl in the photograph, and she was currently in a room with a man who killed for sport. "Watch the woman," I said, my voice barely audible but as hard as flint. I didn't wait for his response. I kicked off my work shoes and hoisted myself into the chute. The climb was a claustrophobic nightmare. The shaft was a vertical tomb of galvanized steel, and every movement of my limbs created a rhythmic thud, scrape that sounded like a drumbeat in the silence of the house. I hauled myself up using the rivets and joints, my muscles screaming, my breath hitching in the restricted space. When I reached the horizontal ventilation duct that fed the second floor, the air grew thinner, warmer. I crawled on my stomach, the metal groaning beneath my weight. Through the slats of the first vent, I saw the hallway. Junseok was a shadow below, moving toward the nursery door, drawing every eye and every gun in the room toward the main entrance. He was the distraction. He was the sacrifice. I reached the vent directly above the nursery's walk-in closet. Peering through the narrow gaps, I saw the back of a man's head, Kang Min-tae. He was seated in a rocking chair, a suppressed pistol resting casually on his knee. In the corner, huddled under a mountain of stuffed animals, was a small, trembling pile of pink fabric. My heart stopped. Harin. I reached for the screws holding the vent cover in place. I had spent my life trying not to be seen. Now I realized that being a ghost was my greatest weapon. Min-tae was looking at the door, waiting for a monster to burst through. He wasn't looking at the ceiling for a waitress. I took a breath, gripped the edge of the steel, and prepared to drop into the one place I had spent my whole life avoiding, the center of the storm. The vent cover came away with a silent, practiced ease I didn't know I possessed. I dropped from the ceiling like a falling shadow, landing on the thick plush carpet of the nursery with only a faint thud. Kang Min-tae reacted instantly, spinning the rocking chair toward the closet, but he was a split second too slow. I didn't reach for a weapon I didn't have. I lunged across the floor, sliding on my knees until I reached the corner. I scooped Harin's small, shivering body into my arms and rolled behind the heavy mahogany crib, shielding her with my own chest. "Don't look, Harin," I hissed, pressing her face into my red blouse. "Stay small." Min-tae stood, his suppressed pistol leveled at the crib, his eyes cold, robotic, devoid of the panic that was currently roaring through my veins. "A waitress," he mused, his voice a dry rasp. A ghost trying to play hero. Move aside and you might see the sunrise. No, I said. It was the loudest word I had ever spoken in my life. At that moment, the nursery door exploded inward. Junsuk didn't come in shouting. He came in like a force of nature. Min-tae pivoted, firing twice, the muffled thwip, thwip of his silencer punching holes into the doorframe. But Junsuk was already low, moving behind the cover of a toy chest. The room turned into a blur of motion and violence. I stayed pinned against the floor, my arms wrapped so tightly around Harin that I could feel her tiny heart racing against mine. I was the only thing between this child and the crossfire. Min-tae lunged for the crib, trying to regain his leverage, but Junsuk intercepted him mid-air. They crashed into a bookshelf, sending hand-painted wooden blocks and fairy tales raining like debris. It was a brutal, silent struggle, two predators fighting in a room built for innocence. Junsuk's fury was quiet and terrifying. He took a strike to the ribs just to get close enough to drive his shoulder into Min-tae's chest, pinning the assassin against the wall. With a roar of effort, he disarmed him, the pistol skittering across the floor toward me. I didn't reach for the gun. I reached for Harin's hand, pulling her deeper into the safety of the closet as the final blow landed. There was a sickening crack, and then silence. Junsuk stood over the crumpled form of the man who had tried to steal his world. He was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps, his suit jacket torn, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. He didn't look at the body. He turned toward the closet, his face softening into something raw and unrecognizable. "Harin," he choked out. The little girl let out a sob and sprinted toward him. Junsuk dropped to his knees, catching her and burying his face in her hair. I stayed on the floor, my back against the wall, the red silk of my blouse stained with dust and sweat. I was trembling, the adrenaline finally receding to leave me hollow.
The sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, casting long golden fingers through the shattered glass of the estate's windows. The air was cold, but the violence had finally settled like dust. In the driveway, the police lights flickered in silence. Junsuk's reach ensured there were no sirens, only the quiet, efficient cleanup of a war that officially never happened. I stood on the terrace, my red blouse ruined, my hands finally still. The ghost was gone, replaced by a woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and didn't blink. Behind me, the glass door slid open. Junsuk stepped out, his daughter, Harin, fast asleep in his arms, her small face peaceful, as if the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. He stood beside me for a long time, watching the city wake up. The weight of his presence was different now. The predatory edge was tempered by a profound, quiet humility. "The board has been dismantled," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Su-yan and the others, they won't be coming back. Not today, not ever." He looked at me, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "I spent my life buying loyalty. I bought guards, I bought politicians, I bought partners. And yet when the world caught fire, the only person who stood in the flames for my daughter was a woman who owed me nothing." I looked down at my scarred knuckles. "I didn't do it for you, Mr. Park. I did it for her." "I know," he whispered. "That is why you are the only person I can never truly repay." He shifted Harin's weight and took a step closer. "You can go back to that lounge. I can give you enough money to ensure you never have to carry a tray again. You can disappear, just like you always wanted." I looked at the city below, the millions of lives where I had been a nameless face, a ghost in the machinery. The thought of going back to being invisible felt like a different kind of death. "But," Junsuk continued, his voice dropping to a tone of absolute gravity, "I am asking you to stay, not as a waitress, not as an employee.
I need someone who isn't afraid to tell me when the shadows are moving. I need someone Hareen trusts. I need someone I trust." He reached out, his hand hovering near mine, an invitation rather than a command. "Stay at the estate. Be her guardian. Be my confidant. Be the one person in this city who doesn't have a price." I looked from his hand to the sleeping girl, then to the man who had been a monster until a waitress showed him he was a father. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the anchor. "No more secrets," I said, my voice firm as the rising sun. June Sock bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect he'd likely never shown another soul. "Together," he promised. I looked out at the awakening city. It was still dangerous, still beautiful, but for the first time in my life, it was mine. I had saved a king, and in doing so, I had finally found myself.